As with the dying Franklin Roosevelt at Yalta, or the refusal of Richard Nixon while hospitalized for viral pneumonia to burn incriminating tapes, the historical consequences of Wilson's illness are still being debated, which is only appropriate given the fact that until recently, journalists have told us less about presidential incapacity than historians. Warren Harding, when he was summoned to the smoke-filled room in Chicago in 1920 by his fellow senators, was said, "All right, do you have any skeletons in your closet?" Oh my God, Warren Harding had so many skeletons in his closet, he needed another closet. But of course he said no. Well, the fact is the man had a very serious heart condition, which he didn't tell anyone about, and which led to his death in August of 1923. And immediately rumors were about that his wife poisoned him because she didn't want him to experience the heartbreak of the scandal known as Teapot Dome. More recently, there's a scholarly consensus that she didn't poison him, but should have. Only in recent years, again, only in the last 10 years, have we discovered that Calvin Coolidge, who was likened to Nero, except Nero fiddled while Rome burned, Coolidge slept. The fact is, Coolidge was in the vice of clinical depression for much of his presidency, for the most poignant of reasons. In July of 1924, less than a year after he succeeded Harding, he lost his son, the apple of his eye, 16-year-old Calvin Jr., who went to play tennis on the White House court and raised a blister on his foot and didn't pay any attention to it. And within a few days, it became infected, and blood poisoning set in. No penicillin in 1923. No way really to treat the condition. And the President of the United States sat helpless by the bed of his son thinking, I'm the most powerful man in the world, and I can't even keep my son from dying. And at one level, Coolidge actually blamed himself, because if he hadn't been president, it never would have happened. And this contributed to a depression, the severity of which is still being debated. So when you hear about Silent Cal, the man who slept 11 hours a day, just think there's another explanation. It wasn't because he was lazy or lethargic. It's because he was, in fact, depressed. Of far greater significance to history was the deteriorating heart of Franklin Roosevelt during the closing days of World War II. Not content to keep their patient's condition from the press and the public, the doctors attending the president kept it from him as well. Now, there are reporters, of course, in that case, Merriam Smith of the UPI was chasing down rumors about FDR's health, rumors that he was in a Boston hospital near death. Ironically, Roosevelt himself displayed far less curiosity about his condition, his persistent cough, his lack of appetite, not to mention the fact that his doctors were prescribing digitalis pills and frequent chest exams. You'd think if that was your doctor, you'd probably want to know why. And I believe FDR knew why, but he didn't want to know why. Fencing with reporters, the president attributed his condition to flaring sinuses and a stubborn cold. The truth became depressingly apparent to his running mate, Harry Truman, when he joined FDR for lunch 2 months after D-Day. Beneath a magnolia tree planted by Andrew Jackson, the aging commander-in-chief urged Truman to avoid air travel when campaigning, adding that, "This time we may need you." Understandably, Truman revealed none of this when talking for attribution. The fact is, he sat there horrified as the effects of hypertension displayed themselves. Roosevelt could barely pour coffee into a cup. His hand shook so violently. But of course, not a word of that ever reached the public. Instead, Senator Truman, the vice presidential candidate went out and he met reporters. He said, "The president looked fine and ate a bigger meal than I did." And reporters let it go at that. If today's Americans have become familiar with Dick Cheney's enzyme tests, they can thank or blame Dwight Eisenhower. Ike's September 1955 heart attack was the first presidential health crisis of the nuclear age, and it really is critical because they didn't lie. And why didn't they lie? Two reasons. Because Dwight Eisenhower was Dwight Eisenhower. Because he remembered Woodrow Wilson. He remembered the consequence of the lies that were told at the time of Wilson's stroke. And, of course, a third reason, the most important reason of all, television. Television makes it harder to lie, or at least to sustain a lie. He was determined to avoid a Wilsonian cover-up. So, he told his press secretary, Jim Hagerty, "Tell the truth, the whole truth, don't try to conceal anything." Hagerty took him at his word, unleashed a flood of intimate details. Daily briefings before 100 reporters in Denver ranged from the president's diet and sleeping habits to the color of his pajamas. More than a turning point in journalistic history, Eisenhower's frankness transformed public attitudes toward illnesses once seen as debilitating. The fact that the government went on in orderly fashion soothed popular anxieties. So did the president's return to the White House that fall. Of course, there were limits to official candor. On learning of one hospital bulletin describing his bodily functions in graphic language, Ike remarked snappishly that perhaps they were carrying realism a bit too far. In November 1957, he had a stroke. That caused even Hagerty to fear the consequences should reporters discover that the leader of the free world took a few minutes of oxygen every day and relied on Seconal to sleep at night. There were limits to official disclosure. To intimates, the president confessed that he was putting off a prostate operation to avoid distasteful publicity. At times, he fantasized about having the procedure done on a cruiser in the middle of a vacation, exactly as Grover Cleveland had misled his journalistic tormentors 70 years earlier. Meanwhile, his political opponents showed scant inclination to emulate his example of candor. In the weeks leading up to the 1960 Democratic Convention, each of the party's leading contenders spread rumors about the other's health. John F. Kennedy alluded to 4 out of 7 presidents during his lifetime who had suffered from heart disease, a none too veiled reference to Lyndon Johnson's coronary in 1955. In retaliation, Johnson's supporters raised questions about Kennedy's long-rumored and publicly denied bout with Addison's disease, a failure of the adrenal glands for which the youthful Massachusetts senator received frequent injections of cortisone and other medications. The truth lay buried for decades in official archives. At the time, the New York Times accepted claims from the Kennedy camp that his candidate could meet, quote, any obligation of the presidency without the need for special medical treatment, unusual rest periods, or other limitations. The great irony, of course, was the treatment that he received for Addison's disease left him with a perpetual tan. So he looked healthier than anyone, ironically, though that was far from the case. A similar reticence obscured the war waged over their patients or by Kennedy's White House doctors Janet Travell and Admiral George Buckley. Fearing possible narcotic addiction, Buckley objected to Travell's frequent injections of Novocaine to ease the president's back pain. But when Buckley recruited the New York orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Hans Krauss, to prescribe regular stretching exercises and lengthy therapy sessions for the ailing chief executive, JFK fretted that Krauss's frequent White House visits might lead reporters to question his trademark vitality. Years later, historians discovered one source of his vigor: amphetamine cocktails served up by Dr. Max Jacobson, the notorious Dr. Feelgood, whose potions led Kennedy's brother Robert to demand they be tested by the Food and Drug Administration.